Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and today we're going to take a look at the core box for Kastore and his returned keyword. Kastore is a Neverborn and Resurrectionist dual faction master, and his core box comes with Kastore the Awakened, Gwyll as his henchman, Marathine as his totem, and then there are 3 Blood Vessel minions. Kastore the Awakened is a living master with the returned keyword and has a defense of 5, willpower of 7, move of 5, and a size of 3. He comes with 12 hitboxes and has the evasive ability, which reduces all damage he suffers from shockwaves, auras, and blast effects to 0. He also has hard to wound to add to his defensive capabilities, which makes all damage flips against him suffer a negative. He has final preparations that states during the end phase, any one friendly return model with an 8 may suffer 2 irreducible damage to take the interact action. And then finally on the front of the card, we have the ability Insatiable that states once per activation, when this model would heal in excess of its maximum health, enemy models within 1 of this model suffer 1 damage. This model may draw line of sight and range for this aura, from a friendly Marathine instead of itself. Flipping over to the back of Kastore's card, the first attack action listed is Devour. This is a stat 6 range 1 melee attack with a built-in ram and is resisted against move. The target suffers 2/3/5 damage, and once per activation, when this action would make a damage flip, this model may choose to either receive 2 positives to the flip or have the target discard a random card. With that built-in ram on the stat, we have 2 ram triggers, the first of which is Drink Blood. When resolving, this model heals an amount equal to the damage suffered. The second trigger on rams is Ritualistic Sacrifice, friendly returned only. After killing, drop a scheme marker anywhere on the table. The second attack action available to Kastore is Dominate. This is a range 8 attack, there's no gun symbol here. And it is a stat 7, resisted against willpower, but has a TN of 14, so you'll need a 7 to get this to go off. Non-master enemy only. Target suffers staggered and stunned. There are 2 triggers on this ability, the first of which is on a crow called by blood. Once per turn, push the target up to 4 inches towards a returned model in its line of sight. Then all returned models within 1 of the target heal 2. The second trigger is Enthrall. This is on a mask. Once per activation, target takes a general action chosen and controlled by this model. The target ignores its staggered condition and is not treated as engaged by return models when resolving any generated actions. Moving down to Kastore's tactical actions, the first one is Bountiful Feast. This is a range 4 with no stat, no resist. This just happens when you want it to happen. Once per turn, enemy models within range must pass a TN 13 defense duel or suffer 1 damage. For each model damaged this way, a different friendly return model within range may heal 1. The final tactical action for Kastore is his bonus action called Broodmaster's Domain. It's a stat 6 and needs a TN of 10 to go off. Target a friendly Marathine, ignoring range and line of sight. Push the target up to its move, then drop a scheme marker into base contact with the target. When Madness first dropped, Kastore was the master I was the least excited about, and as I've put him on the table, he's definitely elevated my interest levels in him for the factions that he's a part of, and I think that's one of the sneaky things about Kastore 1 is that just looking at him on paper doesn't give you a really great idea of how he fits into his role. I feel like he's extremely dynamic and flexible in his game plan. There's a definite theme of survivability, especially when you kind of pair his keyword together, but just within his own card, having hard to wound and not needing to rely on soul stones a ton, the only thing he's really going to be using them for outside of prevention and positives, I guess, is going to be the building in suits on Dominate, because those suits on Dominate are such an extension of the ability. You will want them almost every time you end up using this attack. But noticing that Devour resists on move, and then he has the Dominate for stunned and staggered, means that he can set himself up really well, where he can kind of get not guaranteed hits, but he is much more likely to hit and can dig himself out of any kind of situation that he's put himself into, really, by healing off of the drink blood trigger constantly. And with Dominate being a stat 7, there's very little in the game that he's going to have troubles winning that against. Like, if you absolutely need to hit something, you can keep some of those high cards in your hand to make sure that it goes off, and then choose whether you're doing like you're in Thrall or Called by Blood. I think that having a master that relies very little on Soulstone use lets you make sure that you have the tools you need in your list without having to sacrifice that extra massive stone pool that you want to hang on to. And you can let some of your other Soulstone users kind of get their share too, because the master isn't, kind of sucking them all up. And with the massive amount of healing in this keyword, it's very easy to make sure that Kastore doesn't lose himself in the shuffle between Hard to Wound and Soulstones. I think the only action that you can trick yourself into taking is Bountiful Feast. And the reason why I say that is Kastore already has so many great actions on his card that you're not ever at a loss for things to do with him. But Bountiful Feast has this weird mode of like you don't want to try and build into it, right? You don't want to put yourself in a situation where Bountiful Feast is going to be amazing for you. Sometimes it accidentally happens because one of the best ways to try and deal with Kastore is to surround him by models and your opponent tries to take you out before you can heal yourself back up. And that's difficult to do unless Kastore's already gone, so you do want to be a little bit cautious about putting him into a position where he could have multiple models dump into him, because the best way for him to get himself out of a bad situation is by just using Devour constantly to drink blood from the models that he's hitting. Now, if he does have a bunch of models around him, your opponent's enabled this Bountiful Feast play, I don't even know if it's really going to get you all that far, because it would mean that if you're trying to get overheals on other return models, then they would have to be healthy. And if they're healthy and around Kastore, I don't think that's going to be extremely beneficial. I think you'd be better off trying to get yourself out of the black by punching a bunch and healing Kastore up instead of using Bountiful Feast to try and enable some cute play. If Bountiful Feast did something additional, I might find some more value in this action, but I think it's easy to get trapped by Bountiful Feast. I think one of my absolute favorite things about Kastore is his final preparations ability. He does feel like he can get the schemes going. Like, that's why I feel like he's so dynamic. He can punch things, he can do a bunch of damage, he can heal himself back up, he can control your opponent with Dominate. There's just very little that he can't do. And with final preparations, I think that it's really easy if your opponent is extremely skilled in being able to deny you scheme play, like they've interpreted what you're trying to do and have ways to try and stop that, final preparations can really throw a wrench in their plans, because they don't really get much of a say at the end of the turn when you just zap something for 2 irreducible and take that interact action. The 8-inch bubble, it kind of gives Kastore this, like, I'd say like a 17.5-inch bubble of being able to drop a scheme marker at the end of the turn, and that can be just the bit that pushes you over the top to completing a scheme against an opponent who's really trying to tear it down. I feel like we can't talk about the Broodmaster's Domain action until we touch on Marathine. So Marathine is Kastore's totem, and it really is an extension of both versions of himself. Marathine is a 4-cost Enforcer totem with the returned keyword, has a defense of 3, willpower 6, movement of 5 at size 1, and then it has no damage at all. And that's because it has the Living Blade ability. This model does not have health and cannot suffer damage or be killed. After a friendly Kastore is killed, remove this model from the game. It also has the Insignificant ability, so it can't take the interact action and is ignored for strategies and schemes. And then it finally has the Slip By ability that states the model can move through other models or vice versa, and is never considered engaged and has no engagement range. Looking at the back of Marathine's card, we have one attack action called Living Weapon. This is range 1, has a stat of 6, and resists on defense. Once per activation, the target suffers 2/3 damage, ignoring hard to kill. Then, a friendly Kastore heals an amount equal to the damage the target suffered. There is one tactical action on the back of Marathine's card called Remove Their Claim. It has a range of 1 with no stat or anything, and it just states, target an enemy scheme marker, remove the target. So with Marathene in view now, you can see some of the more interesting parts about Kastor's kit. I had stated that he is a little bit more scheme driven, and not really that that's his main thing, but Marathene being able to just within 1 inch remove scheme markers and then use Broodmaster's Domain to push around and then drop scheme markers wherever it wants to. The big thing about Broodmaster's Domain with this is that it ignores range and line of sight, so Marathene can be anywhere on the table, and you can either pull Marathene back into the game or push Marathene forward to drop that scheme and then later on pull it back in subsequent turns. So like Marathene is just one of these pieces where it never can be ignored or discounted by your opponent. Like they always have to be thinking about what Marathene can do, and knowing that Marathene has such a high mobility between Kastore being able to get it to where it needs to go and then just being a speed 5 model that can move through other things. Now, only having a once per activation melee attack sounds kind of rough, but I kind of just look at it as Kastore stapling 2 extra actions on himself, where it's, remove, claim, or charge with a living weapon attack, or, dropping the scheme marker. That's kind of how I look at it. And the thing about the living weapon is it gives you another way to try and get Kastore healed up if he has activated, done a bunch of devour attacks, and then your opponent's response is to beat on him some more. You can still get some healing going on there. With the ability to heal Kastore on Marathine's activation, that does allow his Insatiable to happen, where if he does heal in access, he can do 1 damage to the models around him, but he can also choose to do 1 extra damage to the models around Marathene. So in the worst case or best case scenarios, I guess, Marathene could turn its attack to a 3/3/4, and that's pretty stable, or a pretty good way to try and hunt down some more easy to pick on models. Again, Marathene just is, you have to think of it as an extension of Kastore to allow him to take attacks in places where you really don't think he would get to. When Gwyll is not drinking Baileys from a shoe in his waters, he is serving as Kastore's henchman that is included in his core box. For 8 soulstones, we get a living henchman with the returned keyword from the Resurrectionist faction, with a defense of 6, willpower 6, move of 5, and size 2. Gwyll has 8 health boxes and has the abilities Cling to Death, that states when a friendly return model in line of sight heals, it may choose to reduce the heal to 0. If it does so, it is treated as having healed in excess of its maximum health. He also has Disguised, so this model can't be charged or can't be the target of actions generated by a charge action. He also has Hard to Wound, where damage flips against this model suffer a negative, is unimpeded, so unaffected by severe terrain, and has the Whisper in their ear ability. When any leader in play activates, this model may discard a card to draw a card. Flipping over to the back of Gwyl's card, we have the first attack action as Decay. This is a range 8, stat 6 with an inbuilt ram that resists against defense. The target suffers 2 blast, 2 blast, 3 blast damage. Models damaged by this action gain injured +1. It has a crow trigger for infested with leeches. Until the end phase, the target cannot heal. The ram trigger is life and death. When resolving, friendly living models that would be damaged by this action instead heal 2. He also has Dispel Magic, stat 6, or range 6, stat 7, resisted against willpower with a TN of 12. You end 1 condition on the target. Moving down to Gwyl's tactical actions, the first one we see is Essence Transfer. This is range 12, stat 6 with a TN of 10. Target 2 friendly models. 1 target may suffer any amount of irreducible damage to a maximum of 4 or its current health, whichever is lower. The other target heals an amount equal to the damage suffered. It has a tome trigger for Prepare the Ritual. Both targets must be return models. Drop a scheme marker within 2 inches of the damaged target. The first bonus action that's on Gwyll is going to be Sanguine Evocations. Look at the top 3 cards of this model's fate deck, discard any number of them, and place the remaining cards back on top of the deck in any order. This model suffers 1 damage for each discarded card. And then the final tactical action, that's another bonus action, is going to be Wise Counsel. This is range 4 with a stat 6 and a TN of 10. Target a friendly model that shares a keyword with this model. The target gains focused +1. So Gwyll is utility central. There's so many things on his card that every time you end up looking at his card, something new pops out. And whisper in their ears something that you almost want to get tattooed to your hand when you're playing the game. I've gotten through one game where I only forgot it once, but outside of that, most of the games that I've played is probably like 70% success rate on those. But outside that, having Disguised and Hard to Wound and a lesser reliance on soul stones for building in suits makes Gwyll quite survivable. It's really a good pair up with Kastore because neither of them really need soul stones to do what they need to do. They're really using soul stones to kind of just survive, so you're not really funneling a ton of stones into this model. Cling to Death is one of those abilities that looks like it's a necessary ability when you first kind of absorb the whole keyword and what it does, but it really isn't necessary until you absolutely need it. And I know that kind of sounds dumb, but it's not something that I'm trying to make sure happens all the time. Like if Kastore's at 10 hitboxes and he's only going to heal 1 from something, then sure, maybe I might use Cling to Death to do some extra damage with something with his Insatiable, or maybe I might stop Barbaros from going up to just barely full by making sure he can do some damage as well through Insatiable. It's just Cling to Death is really nice when you need it, but it's not something you're always going to need. Outside that, when you flip over to the back of Gwyl's card, Decay is such a powerful attack action for this keyword, and having that built-in ram to make sure you can get life and death to go off so you're damaging your opponent, healing your own models that are in combat, and sticking out injured, make sure that you can target down the models that might have an easier time resisting against Dominate, and setting Kastore up to make sure that he can actually land that if it is a high willpower model he needs to get into. The Infested with Leeches is cute, but I don't know if I've ever really had a moment where it's come up. I haven't played Kastore against a crew that does have a lot of healing in it, but I can see that it's a nice tool to have in your belt if you ever need to pull it out. Dispel Magic on this guy is so valuable. I think that with all of the positives that Kastore can kind of make happen, or how easy it is for him to hit, trying to get rid of things like Distracted is really important, or even just ending some of your opponent's focus conditions offensively, because being stat 7 on this is pretty intense. He's a henchman that will have very little difficulty pegging down conditions on models that have like your average willpower. Essence Transfer is interesting. I think this is another shovel ability where if you're in a sticky situation, he can kind of dig yourself out of it. I only had the chance to use it once effectively, and when I did that, I failed Barbaros's Bring It to get Gwyll into position to make it happen. But having a 12-inch range on being able to juggle hit points from one model to the other is such a huge thing. There are lots of models in Kastore's keyword that are beefy boys, but they don't have a lot of built-in survivability, so being able to essence transfer can really mess with your opponent. They might think that they're fine with kind of staving off or holding off on punching at a model, thinking that it's not going to regenerate and Gwyll isn't around to be able to shoot Decay, but getting that extra 4 inches on being able to zap health over and then possibly drop a scheme marker if you hit that tome trigger is quite potent. Gwyl's bonus actions also are just so valuable. Being able to, for a 4 of any suit, stick focused on one of your models is massive, and when you, again, like Whisper in their ear and Sanguine Evocation are the main ways that you're able to manipulate the deck, or at least increase the value of your cards. And I don't think Gwyll minds being pegged for a couple damage here and there. Mostly he can always decay himself if he's absolutely in trouble. But I think Gwyll plays so far back that it's very unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to get damage on him or put him into a position where he's in trouble unless they are super gunning for Gwyll, which I can't see being the worst idea in the universe for someone playing against Kastore, because Gwyll is such an important piece. You don't really understand how much you need Gwyll in a returned keyword crew until you don't have him. The minions that take up residence in Kastores Core Box are the Blood Vessels. For 5 Soul Stones, we have a Minion 3 Undead Return model with Defense 4, Willpower 4, Move 4, Size 2, and 5 health boxes. The abilities start off with Black Blood. After this model suffers damage from an action or trigger, every model within 1 suffers 1 damage. This model ignores damage caused by Black Blood. The next ability, Faith in the Flesh, is something that appears on many of the return models, but it's the first time we're seeing it in his core box. It states, when this model activates, it may suffer 1 damage to have another friendly return model within 4 heal 1. Additionally, if this model would heal in excess of its maximum health, it may move 2 inches. It comes with Hard to Kill. When this model suffers damage, if it has 2 or more health, it may not be reduced to below 1 health, and has Ready to Serve. While this model has 4 or more health, it receives +2 to all of its dual totals. Flipping over to the back of the Blood Vessels card, there's one attack action called Ceremonial Weaponry. It's a range 1 melee attack with a stat of 4 that resists against defense. Target suffers 2 3/3 damage. If the target is a friendly return model, it instead heals 0 1 2, ignoring any negative or positive modifiers. There is a tome trigger for Catch a Glimpse. You look at the top 2 cards of your Fate deck and then place them back in in the same order. There are 2 tactical actions on the Blood Vessels card. The first one is Sacred Duty. It's range 10, stat 5 with a TN of 12, once per activation. This action does not require line of sight. Target a friendly returned non-minion model. Place this model into base contact with the target. It has a ram trigger for sudden strike. This model may take a melee attack action, and then has a mass trigger for on guard. Until the end phase, enemy models suffer -1 to their attack actions against the target. The final tactical action is the Blood Vessel's bonus action called Rite of Sacrifice. No range or TN or stat or anything, it just happens when you want it to. This model suffers irreducible 2 damage. This model may take the interact action. So Blood Vessels are an interesting minion. I've played these several times now, and I don't think that I'm disappointed with them, but they definitely have some confusing roles. They're not really great at any one of them, though. When you look at them at face value, they kind of seem like they want to kind of body block for some of the more intense models that you have, your Enforcer's Henchman or Kastore himself, and Sacred Duty makes sure that they don't get outpaced by being only move 4. You can get quite a bit of movement out of them if they're using Sacred Duty to stay around some of those models, but the Enforcers and Henchmen in this faction, they don't really play where you think you're going to get a lot of value out of these, so it almost seems like the Blood Vessels are stapled to Kastore if that's the role you want to put them in. You know, you're wanting to trigger Faith in the Flesh to heal other models and scoot these guys up, and then Black Blood can also do some extra damage if your opponent wants to start punching them, because hard to kill 5 Soulstone models can be really annoying to get through, especially if there's 2 of them that are kind of sticking in front of Kastore himself. The other thing that it looks like is a role they can fit in is kind of being a scheme runner, and I won't say a scheme runner, it's more like they're a scheme brisk walker, because they're speed 4, but they still have the ability to do an interact walk interact or a walk interact walk to try and get into places, and these things they're just annoying enough to kill to where your opponent might not really want to go after them, and their attack is somewhat reliable-ish. Having 2 3/3 damage means that if a scheme runner comes into them, these guys probably could bonk them a couple times and dump on the scheme runner. So I won't say that they're really well matched into taking on other scheme runners or hunting them down, because I don't think they could hunt down a cheeseburger if they wanted to, being as slow as they are. But I definitely think that if you look at these models, again, much like I had said with Kastore earlier, and feel like they're just something that's going to sit on your shelf or sit in your closet unbuilt, I think it's worth getting them on the table to at least see how they feel, especially if you're only working with the core box right away, because making sure that you understand Faith in the Flesh, that's probably where most of the complexity comes with this crew, is understanding how the little like waterfalling triggers of healing work within this keyword. But I don't think that Blood Vessels are completely bottom of the barrel trash models, but they definitely are something that you need to work really hard to get to do what you want them to do. It's just really like how you want to approach them on the table, I guess. I definitely want to make it, I just want to make it clear that, like, I'm not down on blood vessels. I just think that you have to really work hard to get them to do what you want. I want to take some time talking about Kastor's title version. I think that titles are such an amazing addition to the game that you really can't talk about the first version of a master without also including the title, because they are kind of interchangeable in the list building process, right? I know that, like, for myself, typically I just kind of figure out what I want to play and then put it on the table. Like, I don't go through that normal tournament selection process of, like, okay, let's see the schemes and strategy, let's see the table and what faction is my opponent playing. Now I get to figure out what master I want to use, and then once you get to that point where you know what your opponent's master is, what their faction is, the table, the schemes, strats, and everything, that's when you get to change whether you want to play with Kastore 1 or Kastore 2, in this case Kastore Fervent. And I think that there's so much value in that mechanic as long as the title master or the title version complements the other one. And it's not so much a compliment that I'm kind of looking for. I'm looking for more of a contrast. Like, I want one version to be very different from the other and bring different things to the game. And when you look at Kastore 1, he has definite scheming potential, a lot of like brick healing potential where he just kind of goes into a place and exists. He can also manipulate your opponent's models to make them less effective and either pull them into danger or push them away from scoring elements. So I think that what Kastore 2 ends up bringing, who I affectionately refer to as Count Slapula, he is just a monstrous beast. He now has faith in the flesh and then has this feast on the faithful ability where if he ever would take damage from black blood, he ends up reducing it and then also heals one for it. So that's a way for him to kind of get in the mix with other models and start tearing people apart and letting other people tear his other pieces apart while he's healing. He still keeps hard to wound, but has terrifying 12 now, so it's much more difficult for people to actually connect with him. They have to go through a couple hoops to do it. And then having Ruthless just makes it so that he doesn't have to go through those hoops himself. He does go up a health box to 13. But then when we look at the back of his card, one of the things that really stands out is in his tactical actions, his bonus action is now the Broodmaster's Blade, where Marathene doesn't move and drop a scheme marker. Now Marathene gets to charge. Now he doesn't have the Insatiable ability to make sure that Marathene can get that min 3 attack out there. But now Marathene can get pushed around the table in ways to start attacking. So again, it takes Marathene and makes it a complement to Kastore, because Kastore 1, a little bit more scheme driven, and now Kastore 2 is very much punch driven. And looking at his attack actions, Blood Rush having range 2 gives him a little bit more of a threat extension. I should mention that one of the dips in Kastore 2 is that he goes down to willpower 5. So if your opponent has a faction that can leverage willpower, this is where you might not want to be dropping Kastore 2, because he is a little bit easier to control, but goes up to move 6. So again, you got that 8-inch threat range off of just one single charge action. And that threat range gets really interesting with Kastore because he can hip hop around the table a little bit, where if you end up getting a charge off of someone or off on someone, the additional part of Blood Rush is that you get to drop 2 blast markers and then put Kastore into base contact. This is an interesting way to put some damage on a front-facing model and then say, I don't want to go into your catcher's mitt anymore, and I'm going to blast off into either like a master or a henchman or something easy to pick on to get into those backlines, maybe a support piece or something. And he has it doesn't have a built-in stat anymore, so now this Kastore is a little bit more reliant on soul stones to get the consistency of what you want from him. But having the mutilate trigger to enforce slow to make sure that he can't be attacked at full capability is good. You're able to heal models that are around you, which I don't see Loyal Servant, at least in my practice, it didn't function very well for me because Kastore was often off on his own doing stuff. I'd unpack him so early. But then Tear Off a Bite on the Rams is where you get to heal him up a little bit. So it's not quite the same as Devour, but you are getting some version of being able to heal him up within himself. Visceral Rampage is an extremely interesting attack action for Kastore. It is just a 2-inch attack, so it's not quite a melee attack action. Well, I mean, it's not that it's not quite, it just straight up isn't. But it is fighting against move again, but we don't have ways to apply that that staggered ability in this version of Kastore really well. So you are doing stat move 6 against move, which is above average for what's mostly in the game, but you want to be picking on the slower things for this one for sure. But this particular ability states this attack action cannot target the same model more than once per activation. Target suffers 1 damage, and then push this model up to its move in any direction. Then place the target in base contact with this model. So Visceral Rampage allows you to get up into a model, punch it for a damage, but then you're able to displace Kastore, and this can either be like a yo-yo technique of trying to do you want to like start the alpha but not leave Kastore kind of swinging in the breeze. So you can push up, do some damage to someone, pull Kastore back, and then pull their model back. And that model doesn't have to be in front of Kastore. You can go ahead and put that behind Kastore and then kind of feed them to the rest of your crew that's hanging out behind him. And you're able to then get Kastore into the position where he's able to heal and do all these other things. You have a couple triggers here where you can do Neurotic Decay. This model may suffer 2 damage when resolving, and the target suffers +1 damage for each damage suffered when declaring the trigger. So this lets you start that damage process a little earlier. Since this one only does 1 damage for the attack, getting that crow means you can get some extra damage out there, and typically you won't have to worry too much about healing. This is where you can get really trigger dependent, because if I'm going to be doing Necrotic Decay on a Visceral Rampage and then following up with a Blood Rush attack, I might want to build in triggers on both the Ram for the Tear Off a Bite and the Crow for Necrotic Decay. But then we have Stagger as a trigger for masks, which doesn't really help us in the proactive way of Visceral Rampage, because we can't target the same model twice in an activation, so we can't go for that move duel and then stagger them to make the subsequent Visceral Rampage more effective to try and pull them back further. So stagger here is not something that I'm typically digging for, but you could get to a point where like you attack somebody, put the stagger on them so they have a harder time getting back into position. And this is just speaking about position. The other way you can utilize Visceral Rampage is by getting into a model and then pushing it further back away from its crew, kind of like another way of doing Blood Rush, but just taking the model in front and pushing it back further. I think that that's kind of the weird displacement things that go on with Kastore 2 here. It's just I think that it's one of the things I appreciate the most about Kastore. I feel like there aren't many masters that are in these two factions that have such a vivid difference in how they play like Kastore 1 and Kastore 2 have. They both punch a lot, but Kastore 2 is kind of a beat stick that really messes with your opponent's positioning, whereas Kastore 1 can do that. He's not going to do it as effective as Kastore 2 is, but Kastore 1 is really going to be able to play the scheme game a little bit more and manipulate the table a little bit more than Kastore 2 can. I think like Kastore 2 is really good at functioning on his own, whereas Kastore 1 kind of wants some extra things around him to make sure that he's enabling what he wants to do and getting out all that little ping damage. So at least in my practice of playing, I feel like these two, you could really make it through an event with just bringing Kastore 1 and 2 and having a pretty decent game against just about whoever you want to play against. If they have like some kind of weird anti-healing tech, then maybe that's not going to be really great for you. But I do think that it's important to note that Kastore 1 and Kastore 2 have such a massive difference between the two of them that they really play two different games. So you can't ever really you can't really expect which one, or build your game plan around Kastore or the Returned without really knowing which version of him you're going to get, because it could be two vividly different games. When it comes to expanding outwards on the Returned keyword, I don't think there's a bad direction you can really go. I can say that I haven't built a list with Kastore without Urn Bearers just yet. White Eyes only makes an appearance every once in a while, but Urn Bearers are going to really get their value with being able to get shielded on themselves, put focus out on others, and make things difficult for your opponent between positioning with Lure and how their hazardous aura works. Being punished for hitting a model with black blood and then taking the hazardous while you're there too is just really difficult to try and get into the brick and start to break it apart. When it comes to like Athrak and the Cavern Imps, or Cavern Nephilim, sorry, those models are great too. Like if you went with those, I think Cavern Nephilims, while feeling expensive on the front of the card, they are also fitting into the theme of Kastore in that they really don't suck at doing everything. Like they can scheme really well, they can do some weird positioning stuff, drop scheme markers from range, and just having Regeneration 2 stapled onto their card makes it so that their Faith in the Flesh and all the other healing shenanigans you're going to be engaging in go off quite regularly. Barbaros is another great piece if you're just trying to hit up something small. I have yet to put the Unseelie engine on the table yet, and I think the only reason why is I just don't seem to be able to find a place to fit it within Kastore, and I think I just need some more time with that one. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I've found Kastore to be an extremely fun master to play in both of his iterations, and I could see someone really getting a lot of mileage out of this model considering you can stay within keyword within his returned boxes and not have to stray too far into Neverborn or Resurrectionists to change things up. Even the upgrades make him feel much more different between the two factions. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know in the comments section below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.